Season 6 was intended to usher in a new era of Overwatch 2, with the diversity of gameplay offerings and a brand new support hero. As it turns out, one of the most transformative things about Season 6 is that power creep has well and truly set into this game. Even faster than it did in Overwatch 1, but luckily not as destructive, I think. If you don't know what power creep is, it's the phenomenon in video games where as developers add new content to a game, in order to make the new content relevant, they have to buff its power into existence in order for that new interesting playstyle to be relevant. In Season 6, we kind of got two of these at once because Lifeweaver was buffed into relevance and Allari was released very relevant. And despite Allari having a strong headshot component to her kit, the rest of it is about sustain, building up for a big ultimate. This has caused the game to slow down significantly. We're in what I would call a deployment or turret-based meta. Unironically, Bastion is one of the best DPS in the game. Between Torb's turret, Tree of Life, and Allari's healing pylon, there's a lot of things to cut through before you can actually start dealing damage, making this meta play lots similar to double shield, just without the shields. It's a lot of the same attritional poking down defenses from Overwatch 1. Well, how the heck did we get here? Well, I tried to warn against this when characters like Widowmaker, Tracer, or Sojourn were the best DPS in the game in seasons past. Tried to say that there's worse problems to have. Well, they gone and done it, and just kept buffing Bastion repeatedly until he was easily the most value you can get on DPS in the entire game. They made him viable, all right, but I think he's viable for the wrong reasons, and has an overwhelming outmoded potential to just catch people off guard, not dissimilar to like a Widowmaker line of sight. We were worried about Widowmaker headshots from miles away. Well, now, if you're not prepared to turn a corner and a Bastion sentry just pops out of nowhere, well, that can be the entire team fight done. Keeping in mind that there's all of the deployment stuff to keep him alive and stop from gaining positional advantage. Other issues that I've had with the direction that they've gone with balancing the game is Lifeweaver, rather than buffing offense into his kit, they just continuously buffed things he was already decent at in order to make the most healing in Overwatch 2 we've ever seen. In order to make Lifeweaver viable, they made over healing and over health more prevalent. So we've got a combination of Bastion's armor on transformation, the very forgiving or high burst amounts of healing from Allari. The list starts to go on. And I haven't even mentioned Orisa's insane cooldowns or the recent buffs to Zarya, which allows the triple bubble problem to come back all of a sudden. Why are we answering meta problems with further power creep? This is a troubling position for the devs to be in because they wanted a lot of these heroes to be more viable, or they have an aim, let's say, like we want Torbjorn and Symmetra to be less about their turret power. Well, now Torb is just a bamf in terms of his weapon and has a defensive cooldown and plays in this deployment-based meta. His turret maybe not being the most important part, but adds a little bit of extra random sustained damage. And just for some parallels for you, let's think back to the way the game played at release. There was characters like Lucio that were being deemed the strongest support character in the game. Can you imagine that? And Tracer and Sojourn had their eras as well. Then Widowmaker did. But the thing that I kept trying to remind people is that a lot of that only really mattered for the top tier of gameplay. Whereas most players can learn how to play Bastion or Torbjorn. They have very supportive style cooldown cycles, as opposed to very demanding skill shot requirements to get value out of their kits. While I personally enjoy winning with these characters, I don't think it's very fair to the integrity of the game when deployment turret style kit is dominating like it's almost never done before. I mean, I guess there was one Overwatch League playoff meta where Bastion was meta, but other than that, it's been a while since they forced some of these more niche playstyles into the forefront of the meta. There's a few more problems that this causes, knockoff implications for them buffing up the stats of everything. We'll get through that, and then I'll talk about the solutions I think they have and overall review of it, because luckily I still enjoy playing this meta despite all of this, which just goes to show you how much more fun 5v5 is than 6v6. And I'm looking at you, Group Up Podcast. I might make a separate video talking about that concept in total, but I think the fact that the game doesn't play absolutely horribly and just like dreadful and still has some options and agency is a benefit to 5v5 in general. But a few more problems. An issue I don't think the devs necessarily saw coming is that when you buff up support power to the level level we've gained, tank's life is more dependent on support gameplay than ever before, at least in Overwatch 2. It plays like Overwatch 1, actually. We quickly find ourselves in these metas where you just have to pick the tanks that are immune to death from the support disable kit, because if you dare pick a tank that isn't, you'll blow up and it'll be too hard to execute. It's not even worth your time. Blizzard did recognize that support has gotten insane, but rather than deal with the issue I just said, they dealt with the support's own self-sustainability, which doesn't really help tank feel more playable, other than the fact that you will be able to pressure supports more. The support passive got a massive nerf, where it used to only take 1.5 seconds for your self-regen to kick in. It now takes 2 full seconds. And the reason why I think that's so significant is that in a lot of cases, you don't have a passive. You need, actually, your deployables and big stats and offense to defend yourself now, and stepping out of position means that trying to get back in cover, well, the delay time that you have to fully remain out of any damage, one little diva tick of damage from medium range can stop you from self-regenning. So going aggressive as a tank into the support backline is more viable, thankfully, on the most recent mid-season balance update. But overall, in a tank v tank battle, when you're jockeying for position, the support cooldowns and the way they get used is so much more impactful to your gameplay than it was at the launch of the game. Well, frankly, supports didn't have a lot of tools back then, and there was a much higher execution demand on them, where they had to play perfectly in cover and everyone else could kind of run around like chickens with their heads cut off. And that wasn't fun for most players, so I understand why they've pushed the game in the direction they've done, but the knock-on effect clearly is like tank is just like miserable to play unless you just pick tanks with big defensive cooldowns, and I don't think that is ideal either. It's like they designed the entire tank role first in Overwatch 2, literally said out loud that they just weren't looking at reworking the supports yet, then they attacked that with 2 hero releases as well as a series of balance changes, and now we've arrived at a place where it's leapfrogged the tank overpowered nature, where supports have so many tricks up their sleeves. Tanks are looking at the suite of improvements that they got for their individual character in the role from Overwatch 1 to 2, and like, well, we just don't compete up against all the things supports can do nowadays. I mentioned this in an earlier video, but I'm looking forward to a time where the devs can talk about the game holistically. And what I mean is, Lifeweaver gets added to the game, and I thought he had the premise of a really strong kit. Now, turns out his value was basically non-existent in practice, mainly because simply repositioning wasn't good enough. So they overbuffed his stats. Well, now we actually have both, where he's a very competent healer. The main thing he does is really good, but he also can save teammates in a way that sort of breaks the game, which I suppose is an extension of their design philosophy, because Kiriko, being the offensive version of that, also kind of broke the game. And what I mean by breaking the game is, like, early on in Overwatch 2, it felt really fun where there was a big trade-off if you threw your on a nade aggressively, where maybe you get all of the eliminations from that decision, but you were most definitely going to get traded out for doing that. Now we're in this weird place where whether you're Ana or Bastion or whatever, these characters that are like all in with their cooldowns, and once those cooldowns are down, they're like half a character. Well, there's ways to keep them up that just didn't exist at the start of the game. Alari's 120 heal per second on her beam, as well as the forgiving healing pylon, which can be placed safely and really sustain. There's ways to just smooth out those rough edges that sort of sped the game up, because if there was that little micro mistake that you could recognize as specifically like a Genji or a mobility type character, you knew they didn't have their tool, you could just rush them down. And there was a constant motion to the gameplay, where now, even if you're a little bit haphazard with your cooldowns, someone else on your team is likely to have the cooldown kit to protect you. And oddly enough, the more they've balanced the game, the worse this has gotten, because there's not really like major weak links in the roster besides maybe a Roadhog. So that means like the enemy has a lot of tools to counteract this sort of like perfect team comp, which was an issue that I brought up as a major problem I had with the Overwatch 1 design. Well, now we've got it again in Overwatch 2, where the RPG team comp builder issue, where let's say they have a Bastion and you do not. Well, you better know exactly how to counter a Bastion or you will just lose, because Bastion is so strong right now that if your tank can't eat the damage, or your team isn't mobile enough to outposition it and they just try to play square up against it, you will have a miserable time. And I think that's quite silly and way too much rock, paper, scissors for my liking. A stark contrast to what I was saying at my first initial impression of the alpha of Overwatch 2, where I'm like, wow, this game's like really really free and open and expressive, and you can kind of freely play the positions that are good for your character, well, that's kind of gone now. Now we've got RPG Team Comp Builder because there's so many heroes, so many supports are viable, and there's so many ways to like mark out the weaknesses of your comp, mainly just by making sure you don't play a tank that can be countered. All right, so all those are kind of issues. I think with more game sense, you can still enjoy this meta. Luckily, you still are shooting at things. I guess deployment abilities, clearing those out of the way. There's like some tactics to it. I don't hate this gameplay at all. I'm just sort of surprised at how quickly the power creep just got ramped up from 0 to 100 in this game. It felt like in Overwatch 1, it took subsequent hero releases for that to finally reach its breaking point. Now let's talk about what Blizzard can do from here. There is two paths to the power creep road. And if you followed the channel a lot in Overwatch 1, you know that we've argued both sides at some point, because while at first what I wanted them to do was power down the game to hopefully reach a reasonable equilibrium where it felt like basic shooter kit mattered as opposed to shields and deployment and infinite life like Batiste lamp and things like that, I had hoped that we'd overcome that. But then eventually over time, they just made the game more and more chaotic. And I was like, well, you know, it's not so bad that it plays like this. Just lean into the power creep. Make more things have wacky interactions and make the game more complicated. I think those are the two routes they could go. The biggest standout to me that I think breaks a lot of the logic of the game right now is Bastion, because the buffs they gave him to his recon reload, how effective his tac nade is, how much extra armor he gets when transforming, he just doesn't really have a weakness other than having a big hitbox, and because there's so many abilities to save or pump extra healing or over health into a character, well, Bastion can survive, and he'll just out attrition in the attrition-based double shield deployment meta. But if you knock that out, what raises to the top then? It gets a little scary, because we still have all this annoying kit to clear through, right? I kind of don't even know what they do beyond that point. Do they just drop the power of all of it? This is why I think a holistic view of the game is so important, because you'll get these centerpiece characters that interact with so much of it and mark out other things, because we've seen it before in Overwatch 1, where let's say like they nerf Bastion, like I just said, but don't nerf anything else. Well, then the overhealing will dominate even more. We'll probably move to the next characters that do the most relevant high amount of damage potential. Whether it's burst or sustain, I'm not so sure, but it might just be that the damage roll gets weaker and supports are just more important. I think a general rule of thumb is to try to scale things down so that basic tank attacks like Winston or Reinhardt can make space and feel like they can secure an elimination. Because if they can't, and there's characters that too easily just out heal or insta delete them from either the support or damage category, I think something's gone a bit wrong. Because it's that very principle that forces those same tank players to play Orisa, a character that has somehow both a high amount of damage potential, but also some of the best sustain in the game. Illari can boop you and reposition. Lifeweaver's got multiple saves and a lot of healing. Batiste is jumping away from you and has a lot of healing. So that means you as a tank character either have to have really high damage or really high sustain. Nothing in between really matters. And you got to play a lot slower and smarter in that position to really have an impact, because there's so many targets you just can't kill now because the supports will keep them alive easily without any effort, really. In Overwatch 1, we often would go back to the point that Overwatch plays best when tanks like Reinhardt or Winston are getting played. The reason for that is they're very fair and obvious in what they do, and they tend to only overwhelm you when you've been outplayed. It's not really a quick burst of impact, it's a positional game. But positional games start to lose their power when you can't really force anything out of position with those picks. So what do we think the devs should do about this? What's a reasonable course of action to take? I would be totally cool if they just powered down both the damage and support healing values. I used to always talk about Kuriko's ability to heal so much, where there was eras of Kuriko where you really didn't even have to damage at all. Now that changed over time as other healers got better at healing, so you really can't compete one-to-one, just healing your team and them healing their team, because you'll lose. I actually think that was kind of a progress that got made in that matchup, but I think there's a bit of an issue where Illari both can be like a competent damage forward, as the devs have called it so far, type support, and have insane heal per second. Between the healing pylon and the beam, it's too much all at once on one target. So in my opinion, the heal beam and probably the pylon again should get a bit of a nerf. Those healing numbers are just so annoying and obnoxious. What I think would make more sense for the character is to have some of the heal per second dropped, but maybe some resource gained, so that your heal over an entire match can be the same, but the whole like burst all the health health up really quick, get your tank up to full, then go back to damaging is too nuts for me, while also having the healing pylon up. It's so much multitasking. It reminds of BAP from back in the day in Double Shield, but somehow more effective. 120 heals per second is just too fast. It's like Illari's beam feels like an Ana nade shot combo. It should be more expensive to give that much healing to something in a short amount of time. The reason is, well, you as Winston deal 55 damage a second. So good luck actually damaging anything when it can get healed for 120 from her primary heal. We're not talking about the combo. And yes, you can outlast it and all that, but it's just lame. I don't like it, especially considering how crazy armor health can get in the game. This is part of the reason why Orisa feels so oppressive, because it's like she has her small little windows where you can burst her, but if you can burst her back up into armor health, well, now she's got this crazy sustain just on her face, and then her cooldowns will eventually come back, and you got this oppressive cycle. This is a holistic problem now that we've got a character that has a resource-based burst heal, as opposed to a cooldown one, like Moira or Ana. Moira or Ana have to choose whether to heal with orb or nade, or deal damage. There's a lot of decision on where that goes, whereas healing as Illari is just a little bit of downtime between her ability to do damage, and it's not much. It's more of an APM check than anything, and for higher tier players, well, they easily juggle those skills. And I don't know, I just think like when Kiriko came out, people were up in arms with what she could do, and Illari stops the game from moving, and at least Kiri helped the game move. And in general, I think shooter games are more fun when they're less turrety and more movement and reposition based, but I guess that's my own personal bias. I know people went crazy about Suzu being so good of an ability, and it was, and it still is, but I just think cleansing disables is immediate impact. It feels good to me in a lot of cases for Suzu to be a part of Kiri's kit, and her stat lines just seem kind of balanced out, as opposed to Illari, where you try to engage on an Illari, she outbursts away, you try to fight her team, and she should just pump so much stats into them. It's like if Moira was a stronger character, right? It's like all the things I don't like about Moira with the overwhelming healing stats put into a character that's got a skill shot as well. And I don't hate Illari as a character. It's just like, how many extremely good healers do we need? You've already got Lifeweaver who's doing that now, and BAP was already good at it. But between the three of them, the possibility of them covering for one another, there's a principle in Overwatch where as you add more synergistic kits, it gets stronger naturally when played together. This was the whole double shield concept in principle in Overwatch 1, where Orisa wasn't necessarily a dominant tank unless she had the right off tank. In some cases D.Va, but most of the time it was paired with Sigma to really double down on that turret style bunker comp. Well, now bunker comp exists, but in a different way. It's forced off of the backline synergy, providing what I think is a bit of a silly and haphazard amount of sustain. Looking towards the future, as they keep adding more heroes and possibly adding more, they've even considered that, these entrenched metas where we actually have overlapping kits that can be replaced to fit the current meta standard. Luckily, it adds like variety to the gameplay, but as things are balanced around a new standard, the whole game starts to become about one thing. This meta is about durability, longevity, high volumes of value. I can deal infinite damage, I can block infinite damage, I can heal infinite damage. The team fights last forever, and if you're a character that needs to get in and out quick to get your value, well, you better have done a big amount of impact when you do so. That's like the rules of how the game plays right now. And as they add more characters to that, do they want to balance the new kit up to compete in this MOBA cooldown kit? Like, is this what we want the game to be? Where we all just better learn how to outposition Bastion, or he's gonna shred your whole team just by transforming? I'm kind of curious to what the mainstream opinion on this is, because it's my intuition that players would prefer to be playing characters like Genji, Cassidy, Ashe, Widow, Sojourn, Tracer, Winston, and not go up against tanks that just have 10 extra lives, or supports that are designed to be very forgiving. I was a fan of the support role even when it was considered weak. And there's a whole nother angle to this, that we don't really expect our community to ever learn the game. We just balance the game around what we hope should perform differently. And that's yet another big discussion Overwatch 2 should have with itself, which is something that the developers seem to remember from back in the day of old school game design, but it goes away with live service, where we look at the stats and we just say, well, Lifeweaver's got to get giga buffed, he's losing, as opposed to look at him as as a niche character. Well, he's the new character. He can't do that. He's got to do something. Get him in there and make everything not die in ult fights until you mow down a tree. Is that good gameplay? Or is that just like adding power and new stuff for the sake of it? Does that improve the game? And I say this as a player who loves to play Life Weaver. I'd rather his kit be about his crafty plays as opposed to like corny extra stats. When you apply the right damage boost or nano boost target and timing as Mercy or Ana, you feel like you have a big brain support mind, that you're helping your team with the strategy of the game. Whereas Life Weaver playing keep away and overhealing everything, it's just winning by stats. You're in a defensive position, they struggle to get you out, and you kind of get to win more with extra health now after already being difficult to nail down. Overall, Overwatch has been playing a dangerous game with how much they've allowed stats to solve their win rate problems with different playstyles and kits. Instead of setting a meta standard of what should be rewarded for the game, they're trying to force viability of characters that maybe just should always be niche, like Bastion. Launch of the game, worthless, considered a joke pick, that over time I thought was actually underrated, just underutilized, kind of left on the shelf. Then they overdo it again to the point where you have to play them. I think it's fine for characters to be niche surprise picks, that if you know how to utilize them can surpass expectations, because otherwise we're buffing things into relevance to get the community to try new things, to try to keep the game fun, and you keep doing that over and over again, and it racks up a debt to the power creep god. And before you know it, we're 6 seasons in and we're shooting at turrets all of a sudden. Power creep is here and I have no idea how they're getting it out. Let me know your thoughts on everything we talked about in today's video in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave it a like, and don't forget to click subscribe and the bell icon to actually get notified when our videos come out. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. I'll see you guys next time.